I'm delighted now to also welcome Sue Parnell, who's Professor of Geography at the University of Bristol. And in another change of format, I'm going to leave the two of you to have a conversation. So, Sue, you just respond to Edgar, and off the two of you go. I shall leave you here.
I'm provoked by your alternative framing of the debate about African cities, where you managed to hold on to the SDG formulation, which was such a politically significant gain to get cities in, to get a universal agenda, to get the specifics. And your diagram shows so clearly how they connected, that we were hearing from the mayor of Helsinki is so important. But what I liked particularly about what you were saying was how and I found it quite inspirational, was to think of the African city in terms of more global tropes, if you like, more global ways of speaking, particularly around climate change and digitization. And the fact that the African future is our collective future, our collective common global future, I think comes through really well in that regard. And so it's strategically, it seems to me, to be a very useful reconfiguration of the African city and its futures. But I was also left puzzled as I was thinking about that, because that's quite an optimistic entry point into the urban future. We can reduce emissions. These are the cities that are to be built. We can do things differently with digitization. But there's another shadow on the urban discussion at the moment, which is really about the post-pandemic city. And the way that Africa and African cities are configured in that discussion, I think is much more pessimistic. It's much more isolating. And yet clearly that's also got to be a dominant kind of element to the way that we frame our deliberations. And I just wondered if you had a reflection on how do you balance those things? Where do we go?
Thanks, Sue. And that's a great point. And obviously, within 5 minutes, there's only so much that I can cover. So I think what I was trying to draw attention to was, I guess, at a citywide scale, what are the systemic levers we have to really change, if you will, the operating systems of our cities? Now, but that tends to refer to the hard infrastructure, if you will, because that, of course, is the platform for economies, for communities, and so on. What is equally important, and that I did not touch on, and you're absolutely correct to point that out, is, if you will, the social dimension, which is where communities come in and where neighborhoods come in. And of course, because we have such massive deficits in access to basic services, it means that the public health crisis is already a major challenge and a major inhibitor of productive economic life and so forth. But COVID just blew that out of the water, because we know that with the first wave, and most African governments, in fact, were of the first around the world to introduce responsive measures, and it absolutely destroyed people's livelihoods in the blink of an eye. And so we know that we've got to think public health in relation to the question of livelihoods and jobs. But fundamentally, it's got to be about a model that allows communities to drive that agenda themselves. And so an important part of this is we've got to build an imagination, I think, where we think of social enterprises that is anchored in communities as the main institutional form to address some of the basic need infrastructures, whether it's around alternative sanitation systems, about nature-based solutions to deal with water catchment and flooding, and so forth. And also public health responses and everything associated with that in terms of exercise, walking. I was struck by this morning's comment. We've got walking cities in Africa without it being walkable cities, right? Because the majority of people, of course, have to they can't afford to use public transport, even if it's available, but also particularly green public space and so on. So for me, there's a very direct connection about an imagination of neighborhood level community management and social enterprises driving basic infrastructure services provision and the low carbon transition, where we're looking at alternative methods that is labor intensive, but also materials efficient, to be able to attend to some of the critical basic needs, which are SDGs 1 to 7, of course.
But so, I mean, I buy that, and I think what you're saying is, again, slightly different from what has always been said about the neighborhood scale in Africa, which is basically poor people have to help themselves because nobody else is going to help them. They're going to have to provide services for themselves because nobody else is there to provide for them. But I think that certainly what the SDG discussion does, and what the new thinking about cities is everywhere in the world, is that there has to be a multi-scale intervention in cities, and different people will do different things in different places. So communities and the neighborhood scale has one function, and you pull that out in your presentation. And you also, what I was interested in was that you also pulled out the regional scale, and I was delighted to see that, because it's tended to be, particularly in Africa, something we've ignored, even though catchments, transportation networks, the interlinkages are really fundamentally underdeveloped, and the vitality of the African urban system, it seems to me, is as important as the vitality of the African urban city or town. But when you were just talking then, and when you've been talking now, I was quite surprised not to hear you talking a bit more about local government. I mean, I know you've done a lot on local government, and certainly the scale of local government has been really crucial in mobilizing energy to talk about African cities. I mean, what's your sense? Where are the most strategic entry points politically to push an urban agenda on the continent, which has historically been quite hostile to stronger governance?
Yeah, so thanks, Sue. And again, absolutely critical issues. And so that's why I kind of had to use as code this idea of distorted governance, right? So what we've seen, and I must confess with enormous frustration, is really stalled decentralization over the last 30 years. And in some key African countries that have a leadership function like Kenya and Tanzania and so on, we've actually seen in the last 5 to 8 years re-centralization of certain functions and the stripping away of the authority of certain city governments, notably Nairobi, of course. So, so it's absolutely a worrying picture. And we do need to be clear that given the spatial logics of what competitiveness will mean in a zero carbon context, in a context where the future economies is going to depend on the internalization of value chains to city regional scales, and that the trade relations will be subjected to carbon taxes at the borders of Europe or on the borders of Asia and so forth, we're going to have to up our game very, very quickly, not so much for political inclusion, but for economic viability. African economies are simply not going to succeed in the next 10 to 15 years unless they're able to beef up governance, coordination, planning capacity at the regional scale. And at the moment, we offer an extremely low base. So that's an agenda which I think is ready and ripe to be opened up. And I am seeing some of and where for me there's some positive signs, is that we've seen the maturing of key city level networks. So here I have in mind networks like C40, that brings together cities that have taken the climate change agenda seriously. I've got in mind the innovations that sits through various thematic networks run by ICLEI across various cities. I have in mind the work of United Cities and Local Government in Africa programs. So we are definitely seeing greater momentum around making the case for stronger local government. What we don't have enough of is city-level leadership that can be at the table at a Pan-African level. And this, for me, is the critical issue over the next 5 years or so, is that we're going to have to see mayors, governors rise to the fore to say that really cities is at the heart of Africa's Agenda 2063 success. And we need urgent political form at the continental level, at the national level, and at the multi-level governance scale that includes sort of solving the stalled decentralization problem, but also rethinking the relationship between municipalities and citizens and their organizations.
But on that, and for those of you who are not African specialists, you may not be aware that Africa actually put forward some very clear ideas about its urban vision even before they managed to get the cities agenda into the SDGs. And maybe it's because of that wherever you go on the continent, whether you are walking into City Hall or International Treasury or into a development bank, people actually understand and they reference the SDGs. Not always favorably, but it's a political point of reference. It's a common ground for thinking about what sustainable urban development means. And if you take that point about we need to scale up the leadership on that, I mean, certainly there is about to be presumably some reflection on the SDGs. You know, do we need to extend them given a pandemic? We're halfway through. How far have we got? Where are the gaps? And also maybe some of the stuff about kind of if you're thinking from an African city, what do you need to change? I mean, I know if I were asked, I would certainly have a couple of things I'd like to see put in, which we missed, and I was part of that process. But it makes me kind of go, well, why did we miss putting in urban health into SDG 11? I mean, are there things that you think and you hearing are fundamental to guiding the SDG agenda?